Hey, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Policy and Energy Notes with Neil. Thanks again for tuning into this. Gosh, there is so much happening right now. We're going to cover a lot of ground in this one because there's so much happening in Washington and around the world, starting, of course, with the Trump administration's Liberation Day, the president's plan which he rolled out Wednesday afternoon on tariffs. And look, this is something that the president campaigned on. He was pretty vocal on it. Honestly, I remember being a kid in the 1980s, seeing him talk about tariffs on TV. This is something the president has been, focused on for a long time. Despite all of that, despite the fact that he talked about it openly, has been talking about it for decades, I think that the markets, political Washington, the world, were caught off about how far more aggressive the approach was than anybody expected. This was a far more blunt approach than I think many expected coming into the year, and that's why you are seeing the market fall out. Look, we here at Palmetto, and a reminder, I am Palmetto's Chief Government Affairs Officer. We're still sorting out what this means for the industry and for the company, but there's no doubt this was a consequential maneuver that will be the focus of the American political and policy landscape for the foreseeable future. There's considerable debate about whether this is a negotiating tactic or a long-term change in positioning here in the U.S., and it's something that we all need to confront. But it will have broader implications because there are many other things that are currently happening in the Washington policy environment, namely budget reconciliation, the process that I've referred to in past videos, which will be the vehicle that unlocks the ability for the Trump administration to extend the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and pursue their broader agenda with only a simple majority vote because of procedural dynamics in Congress. But in order to do that, they have to go through the budget resolution process. The United States Senate is in the process at this moment of something called Vote-a-rama, where they're going to spend all night voting on amendments to move forward with their piece of the budget resolution. They moved their own a couple of weeks ago. This is an amended version that they hope they can get on the same page with the House of Representatives because both chambers have to pass identical budget resolutions in order to unlock the reconciliation process. So where the Senate's going right now is very, very interesting. They are pursuing a policy in which they are making the case that extension of the Trump-era Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from the first administration is an extension of current law and therefore should not score. So the $4.5 trillion in costs should not be counted against the score of the bill. I actually view this as someone who cares about preserving the clean energy tax incentives in the bill as somewhat of a positive because it alleviates some of the pressure on members to make cuts. Unclear to me whether this budgetary maneuver will be deemed appropriate by the Senate parliamentarian, but Senate Republicans are trying it. It's going to be a long week for folks in the Senate. Earlier this week, Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey staged a historic 25-hour filibuster. Kudos to Senator Booker for pulling it out. It set the record in the Senate. As a former Senate floor staffer, I have great sympathy for my former colleagues who had to staff such a maneuver. But it brought a lot of attention to the Senate this week, which was needed because there was so much else happening. There were pivotal elections this week that kind of give us insights into what's happening in the United States of America. We saw two special elections for congressional seats in Florida that Republicans won, but at far smaller margins than the incumbents who had previously held the seats had won. I don't look at those as consequentially because, in my view, it's always unfair to compare an incumbent's margin when they ran in a regular election versus a new face in a special election. But the margins were smaller than what Republicans had seen in the past in very Trump-favored districts. I wouldn't read too much into that as it being a reaction to the Trump agenda. It's just a variable. The more significant case was in Wisconsin. There was an election for a Supreme Court seat there where Elon Musk was very heavily involved. Wisconsin was a 50-50 state, has been a 50-50 state. The Democratic candidate won that seat by 10 points. My read there is that that is not necessarily an indication of a policy backlash against what the Trump administration is pursuing. It is a clear indication that the constituency, the low propensity voters that have propelled Donald Trump in 2016, 2020, and 2024, they show up when he is on the ballot. They do not show up when he is not on the ballot. And that is something that Republicans have got to be thinking about heading into the 2026 midterms. The only other thing I want to cite is a little bit of a newsy scoop, if you will. Those of us in the clean tech space who are in favor of the technology neutral tax incentives, the provisions on transferability, the really helpful pieces of the Inflation Reduction Act that have stimulated energy growth and energy dominance in the American economy. We saw a very helpful letter from 21 House Republicans in support of keeping some of these measures. I have a good scoop here. We're about to see a similar letter from Senate Republicans with a critical mass. Remember, the margins are very, very narrow in the Senate, 53-47. Doesn't take that many senators to step up and be in favor of these provisions. Stay tuned. Keep in touch with your inboxes. I believe we're going to have a Senate letter in support of those provisions coming out here very shortly. That's my newsy bit of the week. My final piece of this, I got to give a shout out to my son who was accepted this week and enrolled at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia in the U.S. Very, very excited for my kid and wanted to close Neil's policy and energy news and notes with a shout out to my son.